The launch of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, was Germany's most desperate gamble of the Second World War. It was a gamble Hitler felt compelled to take if his ambition of the complete subjugation of Europe were to become a reality. 4/5 of Germany's total armies, 3 million troops, were committed to the most appalling conflict in the history of warfare. In little more than 1 year, Hitler's armies had reduced vast areas of Western Russia to dust and rubble, and subjected the Soviet peoples to unimaginable brutality. While the Allies looked on, Russia was in agony and being dragged through a nightmare of slaughter to the edge of extinction. In 1941, the conquest of Russia would not only have provided Germany with the agricultural and industrial supplies to ensure Hitler's mastery of Europe, it would have simultaneously rid him of the only military power capable of challenging his domination. The deaths of tens of millions of Russians was not simply an economic necessity. Their destruction would pave the way for the Großraum, a concept already under development by Heinrich Himmler as the culmination of Hitler's call for Lebensraum. The Großraum was envisaged as a gigantic Germanic state stretching from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the mountains of the Urals in the east. The Großraum would be ruled by the master race of Germans, served by the more acceptable of the subhumans within its borders, but eliminating those like the Slavs and the Jews, who were too unredeemably decadent to be allowed to survive. Once established, this superstate would provide Hitler with the ideal platform for his ultimate aim: complete domination of the world. His vision was of a world in which nationalism would cease to exist, replaced by a universal society of masters and slaves. Standing between Hitler and the realization of this vision were the armies of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a fighting force whose condition of unpreparedness paid tribute to the paranoia of its political leadership and the excesses of a state which vied with Germany in the extent of its totalitarian oppression.
The whole ideological thrust of the German plan for war, which was not just a nominal war of conquest, it was intended to be a war of extermination. It was intended first and foremost to root out what they called the Jewish Bolshevik gang who ran Russia. It was designed to destroy the political structure both of the Soviet Union and of the Red Army. So the degree of barbarization which set in at a very early stage in the Soviet-German War, the Great Patriotic War, was a feature which persisted until the very last day of that war.
While Hitler, having dealt with his political opponents during the Night of the Long Knives, was by the late 30s industriously nurturing the leadership of Germany's armed forces, Stalin was busily destroying Russia's. In 1936, Tukhachevsky, chief of staff of the Russian army, was executed for treason following a trial which lasted only a single day. 6 of the 8 generals forming the court-martial which condemned him were themselves to follow suit soon after. By the end of the purge, the Russian army had lost 3 of the 5 remaining marshals of the Soviet Union, all 11 deputy ministers of defense, 75 of the 80 members of the military Soviet, all the commanders of the military districts, 13 of the 15 army commanders, more than half the corps commanders, and approximately 30% of the officers below brigade level. Stalin, however, controlled the balance of power in Europe. And when a German-Soviet non-aggression pact was announced in August 1939, the world was shocked. Cynically burying their ideological differences, Fascist Germany and Communist Russia agreed to take no military action against one another for the next 10 years. In a secret additional protocol, they also agreed to divide the independent states of Eastern Europe between them. The Soviet Union then threatened the Baltic states with invasion unless they allowed Soviet armies to be stationed within their borders. The Balts had little option but to comply. Rigged plebiscites gave a gloss of legitimacy to this invasion. Stalin now controlled eastern Poland and Galicia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Stalin's overall strategy was to create a barrier of Russian territory between the Soviet Union and Germany. Snug behind this defensive wall, he planned to allow the Allies to fight a mutually destructive war in the West. 1 year later, however, Stalin's hopes of a protracted war seemed to have evaporated with the brilliant success of Hitler's Blitzkrieg tactics. The failure of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain only made the Soviet position more vulnerable. An invasion of Britain had been postponed indefinitely. It would still be 18 months to 2 years before Britain would be capable of mounting an attack on the mainland of Europe. The German submarine blockade of her shores and the relentless bombing of her war industries might delay such preparations even further. On the 18th of December 1940, Hitler's manic gaze turned firmly towards Russia. The first Barbarossa directive ominously stated that the USSR might be invaded even before the war with Great Britain was over.
What was built into Barbarossa was not just the German operational military plans, but a huge deception scheme. And the aim of this deception scheme was actually very simple. It wasn't to introduce into Stalin's mind or the Russian mind uncertainty. It was to introduce certainty. And the certainty was as follows. And this is how the Russians proceeded. Yes, they knew there was going to be a German attack. The Germans produced various bits of information or leaked information, and that was certainly clear. Stalin was well aware that sooner or later the Germans would attack. There was also the assumption, very deftly introduced by the Germans, that in fact, before this attack, there could well be negotiations. There might even be, and the Russians now have disclosed this, there might even have been a personal meeting between Hitler and Stalin. And there were two elements to this German position. One was that the massive German military buildup was in fact, if you like, not an inducement, but a form of coercion to force him into a negotiating position. And on June the 14th, he made this perfectly plain by the famous TASS statement saying, look, we know what you're up to. We know all about these concentrations, but there is nothing to prevent a settlement of Soviet-German relations. That was the first thing. The second thing was a certain element of self-deception on Stalin's side to the effect that, one, he strongly believed that Hitler would never embark on a two-front war. It would be folly. Actually, what he didn't realize was Hitler was embarking on a one-front war because the war in the West, though not wound down, wasn't all that active. And the second thing was, again, Stalin's great concern, actually, and I think this went back to the First World War, that although the Soviet General Staff, Zhukov and Vasilievsky and others, and particularly Timoshenko, were urging Stalin to mobilize, Stalin argued, actually, and he shouted at Timoshenko, what do you want, a war? Because the act of mobilization, full formal mobilization, essentially would trigger war. And the final thing was, an important element of his strategy was not to provoke the Germans. And indeed, even on the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, when the German army is advancing, he's still partly persuaded of what he thought was a provocatia. He even imagined it was some breakaway German generals who were trying it on, as it were. This wasn't the real thing.
As the German build-up toward Operation Barbarossa continued, Stalin's attempts to pacify Hitler grew more desperate. He had already stated in an interview with Pravda in November 1939 that it was not Germany who had attacked Britain and France, but Britain and France who had attacked Germany. Stalin now forbade any criticism of Germany to be printed in the newspapers. When Hitler successfully invaded Greece and Yugoslavia, Stalin expelled the Yugoslavian ambassador to Moscow and refused a request to recognize the Greek government in exile. Stalin felt he was continuing to buy time by these unrequited concessions, but his use of the breathing space which he had already obtained was totally devoid of any worthwhile attempt to remedy his military disadvantages. By May 1940, 170 Soviet divisions were stationed in newly occupied territory, with the result that over half the army were occupying positions whose fortifications and rearward communications were incomplete. Indeed, by June, with a German attack imminent, Western's Special Military District was a shambles. Many formations were between 6,000 to 7,000 men short of wartime establishment. Levies of experienced personnel had been hived off to build new tank and aviation units. Only one of 6 mechanized corps had received their full complement of equipment. 3 of the 4 motorized divisions had no tanks, and 4 out of every 5 vehicles in the tank fleets were obsolete. 4 of the corps had only 1/4 of their designated motor vehicles, and in another 4, 1 in 3 motor vehicles needed repairs. Therefore, although the opposing forces had amassed vast amounts of weaponry along their common borders, the Soviet Red Army and the German Wehrmacht were anything but equal adversaries.
The Red Army consisted of about 5 million men. That is in the western part of Russia, never mind those who were in the Far East. And the tank strength of the Red Army on the 21st of June 1941 was 23,108, of which you can argue possibly that 8,000 tanks were battle-ready and in good condition. On the German side, the German strength was roughly about 3.5 million men, possibly with their allies, the Finns, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, and so on. You can bring that up to, let us say, about 4 million. In terms of armor, the Germans were able to employ something like 3,300 tanks. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Indeed, numbers are extremely misleading. The interpretation has really got to be on A, the operational readiness of the armies, in which the Wehrmacht was clearly absolutely superior and ready to go, and was well prepared and briefed for its task. If you look at the Red Army, there were severe problems of manning, organization, training, logistics, supply. Even more important, the Germans were operating according to a plan. And indeed, the work I've done and many of my Russian colleagues showed this, that the Red Army was in an extraordinary position. There was no plan, in spite of what people say. The Red Army could neither defend nor attack.
The awesome German armies which the 170 understrength divisions of the Russian troops faced were divided into 3 large groups. These consisted of 148 fully manned and equipped divisions, of which 19 were Panzer and 15 Panzer Grenadier divisions. The Army Group South was commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and was charged with seizing Kiev and taking control of the Ukraine as far as the river Dnieper. Field Marshal von Bock's Army Group Center was to strike towards Smolensk. Army Group North, under Field Marshal von Lieb, was to attack through the Baltics and seize Leningrad. The 3 German army groups were supplemented by 500,000 Finnish troops advancing from their homeland in 14 divisions, and 150,000 Romanians attacking along the Black Sea toward Odessa. These forces, together with the Luftwaffe, which had devoted 80% of its operational strength, 2,770 aircraft, to the build-up for Barbarossa, fielded over 3,350 tanks, over 7,000 artillery pieces, 60,000 motor vehicles, and 625,000 horses. The Russian army still clung to its peacetime structure. Should war occur, then each military district would be transformed into army groupings similar in structure to the Germans. The North Soviet front was to repel advances through the Balkans and defend Leningrad from Finnish attack. The Northwest, West and Southwest fronts would engage the three main German army groups, and the Southern Front would deal with any advance toward Odessa. Behind these lines, the contrast between the warring nations could not have been greater. While Germany boasted one of the finest industrial infrastructures in the world, Russia had still not completed its industrial revolution. Stalin had declared in 1931 that one feature of the history of old Russia was the continual beatings that she suffered for falling behind, for her backwardness, for military backwardness, for agricultural backwardness. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they crush us. By 1941, a generation of upheaval had left its mark economically and psychologically. Revolution and civil war had been followed by the destruction of the peasantry and their enforced collectivization. Whole segments of the population had been uprooted and transported to work the new industries set up in the mineral-rich regions of Siberia, the Urals, and Kazakhstan. The Russian people, deprived of news of the build-up on their borders, and subject to a media devoid of any mention of the increasingly anti-Soviet rhetoric of Hitler, were totally unprepared for the latest disaster which was about to descend on them. At 0400 hours on the 22nd of June 1941, the maelstrom which was Barbarossa finally erupted. The German armies of the Blitzkrieg sliced through the Russian forces on every front. Faced by the results of his intransigent refusal to act, Stalin panicked. While his army headquarters desperately tried to piece together the most rudimentary picture of what was happening, he ordered an immediate counteroffensive on all fronts. As the first reports of the devastation his own command had helped to create filtered through, he was shattered. All that Lenin created, we have lost forever, he declared. He finally retreated to his dacha, not to emerge until the 3rd of July.
That what stunned the Red Army commanders was that the German army proceeded without any artillery support. It simply sliced through. And what the Red Army command had expected was there would be a meeting engagements, you would have opening actions. That would develop over, let us say, something like 10 days. You would have large, complex frontier engagements, and then the real war would begin. When in 48 hours in Army Group North, German Panzer columns were actually approaching Riga. So this technique, if you like, of the Germans and the use of their armor in that respect came, as I say, as an extraordinary and totally disorganizing surprise, even to senior Russian commanders. And within 48 hours, if you read the Russian General Staff reports, it's perfectly plain they have totally lost control of the situation. The thing is chaos. They don't know where their troops are. They don't know what's happening. They don't have accurate reports of German movements. They're not quite sure where the German thrust is going to be. All that they did know, actually, was to the south, in Army Group South under Rundstedt. That was being slightly delayed. And there the Russians had a little more time to prepare. And if you compare the operational narrative there, yes, the Germans are somewhat held up, not for very long. But in the northwest and in the west, there's total collapse. And of course, the consequence was that Stalin operated his usual practice. He took out the front commanders and shot them.
At the front, the rapier thrusts of the German Panzer divisions were skewering through the chaotic Russian defenses. The Panzer groups created deadly breaches in the Soviet line, slicing the Red Army forces into isolated segments. The supporting German divisions then moved forward in encircling advances, which surrounded these pockets of defenders. The ferocity and effectiveness of the Panzer attacks was so great that some of the pockets were gigantic. Groups of up to 15 Russian divisions were surrounded and mercilessly pummeled into surrender. The encirclement of Minsk by the right flank of Army Group North and the left flank of Army Group Center yielded 300,000 prisoners, 2,500 tanks, and 1,400 artillery pieces. 32 of the 43 Russian divisions were gutted within a week, and the road to Moscow penetrated to a depth of 300 kilometers. The remainder of Army Group North scythed into the Baltics, capturing Riga, the Latvian capital. Only in the south were the German forces limited to shallow advances towards Lwów and Rouno. In the skies, the Soviet Air Force was faring worse than the land army, if that were possible. The mainly obsolete Russian fighters, 20 to 100 miles per hour slower than the Messerschmitt 109s, were constantly outfought. Many of them never got the opportunity of aerial combat. The Luftwaffe claimed to have destroyed 1,500 aircraft on the ground during the first day of Barbarossa. On the ground, chaos reigned. The Luftwaffe were pulverizing the road and rail links behind the Russian lines. Many officers were not even bothering to use code in their desperate pleas for instructions from their headquarters. Struggling masses of uncoordinated troops were being slaughtered by the German troops as they attempted to obey Stalin's orders to counterattack. Others were being machine-gunned by their own military police for fleeing from positions which were worse than hopeless.
The reality was that they were left leaderless. First of all, they really had no orders. Sometimes they had guns but no ammunition. Sometimes they had on many occasions they had tanks but no fuel, or they had tanks which broke down, or they had orders which were contradictory. And there was the usual situation whereby the order simply was advance. What do you mean advance against crack German divisions? And many of the Red Army divisions simply broke up. And what you got were very large pockets of Red Army troops. For example, within a matter of 4 or 5 days, the Wehrmacht, the German army in the east, had managed to encircle 350,000 Red Army soldiers. 350,000. That was the first of the beginning, actually, of a number of huge encirclements.
By the 3rd of July, the battle for the frontier was over. The German armies had advanced along a line from the river Dwina in the north to the Dnieper in the south. General Halder, chief of German General Staff, declared that the war against the Soviet Union had taken only 14 days to win. But the German intelligence had totally underestimated the reserves which Russia could command. By July the 1st, 5,300,000 men had been mobilized. Stalin had emerged from his isolation to broadcast a message of patriotism and resistance to the nation. For once, the Russian people were told the truth. The pre-war complacency which Stalin had done so much to foster had now rapidly to be undone. In Leningrad, when news of war reached the factories, the general consensus was that it would be over within the week. Well, it won't necessarily be over in a week, one Russian worker was reported as saying. It will take them 3 or 4 weeks to get to Berlin. Stalin now took direct control of the Red Army. But the general mobilization of Russian troops failed to curtail the German advance. 4 reserve armies of 37 divisions were dispatched to bolster West Front in the general area of Smolensk. The Germans countered with yet another encirclement, and the panzer groups of Generals Hoth and Guderian smashed through the Soviet line and maneuvered 300,000 Russian troops into an indefensible pocket. Another 150,000 prisoners, 2,000 tanks and 2,000 artillery pieces fell into German hands. Goebbels announced that the eastern continent lies like a limp virgin in the mighty arms of the German Mars. Army Group South finally broke through the Russian southwest front, and another pocket yielded a further toll of 100,000 prisoners.
Now, the scale of these encirclements, 500,000 men, and by the last week in November, Red Army strength dropped to a level which was its lowest during the war because the Germans had taken 3.1 million prisoners. 3.1 million prisoners is an enormous number. Indeed, that was basically the pre-war Red Army destroyed. More than 30 divisions had been completely wiped out. What astonished the Germans, of course, was as these divisions were literally wiped out from the order of battle, more and more divisions took their place. And while the Germans were calculating on the fact that they thought they knew the Russian order of battle, what came as an astonishing and disturbing shock to them was that more and more divisions are coming into the line, not always fully manned, but the Russian order of battle was in fact being steadily built up.
The devastating speed of the German advance was due to the power and tactical brilliance of its panzer divisions. The concept of an integrated armour force had intrigued the German military since the close of the First World War. By the early 30s, 10 prototype tanks had been designed and built in secret. Ironically, the initial development of what would become the most technically accomplished and cost-effective tank program ever seen took place at the German-Soviet tank school at Kazan in Russia. At the outbreak of war in the East, the backbone of the Panzer Corps was the Panzer Mark IV. Designed by Krupp and weighing 17.3 tons, the Panzer Kampfwagen IV carried a crew of 5 at a maximum speed of 18.5 miles per hour. Its armour varied in thickness from 8 to 30 centimetres, and it was armed with a 75mm turret gun and 2 machine guns. Supported by the lighter Mark III, which was similar in size and appearance, the Mark IV swept all before it, until the Russian T-34 tank made its appearance in numbers.
What the Russians had tried to do in between 1940 and 45 was to bring in 2 new tanks, the T-34, which actually was the tank which had been tested in 39, and the rather heavier tank, the Klim-Voroshilov. But they'd only produced about 1,000 of each. So therefore, these T-34s were distributed in very small packets. And remember, the battlefront is about 2,000 miles long. So what do you do with 1,000 tanks? On the other hand, it did come as an enormous shock the first time that the Germans encountered the T-34, because the T-34's armor, mobility, speed, and gunpowder was something they simply hadn't suspected. And Guderian, as you will remember, actually, in November 1941, ran into a T-34 ambush and was completely destroyed.
Russian armoured warfare was inhibited by Stalin's disenchantment with tank divisions, which had led him in the 30s to utilize his armour only in the support of infantry formations. After witnessing German successes on the Western Front, Stalin changed his mind. But the reorganization of Russian armour was not completed before the launch of Barbarossa. Even though Russian tanks outnumbered German 2-1 at the front and 6-1 overall, tactical ineffectiveness, obsolete models and widespread disrepair tipped the advantage overwhelmingly in favour of Germany during the first stages of the conflict.
But it wasn't just the quality of the German tank, it was the capability of the Panzer commanders to do with their armour what was essential. That is, they had excellent command and control facilities. At that time, they had very good support logistical facilities. And indeed, essentially, they knew what they were doing. So that although German Mark II tanks and threes might run up against a huge elephantine Klim-Voroshilov tank, the KV-1, the big heavy tank, and German shells might bounce off them. Nonetheless, such was the, I must say, the haphazard and untrained manner in which the Russians handled their armour anyway, that the Germans soon made short meat of them.
After a month of victorious progress, the German High Command were disconcerted by the rapidity of their own advance. Their armies were now fighting on a front 1,000 miles wide. The Stukas could no longer deliver the concerted hammer blows which had punched the holes in the Russian lines, which the Panzers had so mercilessly exploited. Even though the Soviet Air Force had by now lost approximately 5,000 aircraft, the supply of replacements seemed endless. The factories in the east, which were churning out more effective fighter models, were out of Luftwaffe bombing range. The German air assault began to run low on fighters. The Luftwaffe also had serious supply problems. The distance from home base and the destruction of the transport infrastructure meant that aircraft replacement parts had to be flown to forward airfields. The lengthening supply lines were also affecting the German ground forces. Tank commanders, hundreds of miles from their Polish depots, nevertheless pressed for the final thrust toward Moscow. They argued that only the continuation of the offensive would prevent the Russians from organizing a fresh line of resistance. While many of Hitler's generals disagreed that such an attack should be launched immediately, they were almost unanimous in recommending that Moscow should become the primary objective of the next phase of the war. Hitler, on the other hand, was worried about the possibility of the gaps between the panzer divisions and the main armies being exploited by Russian reinforcements. He also feared that the hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops left behind the German lines in the wake of the advance might coordinate their actions into an effective guerrilla movement. According to the account of one witness to the disarray behind the German advance, he need hardly have worried. One Russian soldier reported, "Thousands of mobilized men from various places which have already been captured and from near the frontline zone roam from place to place. They lack any purpose, any sense of order. They have no uniforms. 20% are barefoot. The leaders are leaving, and they are abandoning us to ruin." Hitler had never been fully convinced of the importance of Moscow and continued to regard it as a secondary objective. The debate stretched out until mid-August. A vital month of summer weather was wasted. The Russians had the breathing space to throw reserve divisions into the gaps in their defences. Barely trained, poorly equipped, some in the battered remnants of their civilian clothing, their stubborn ferocity meant that they were still a force to be reckoned with.
A rapid campaign to crush Russia should have been over by August, wasn't. They had to think again, and the first thing, of course, that they had to think about were logistics and supply. No great preparation had been made for a winter campaign in Russia. The second thing was that the German High Command and German intelligence and the German military as a whole had vastly underestimated the ability of the Red Army to resist. Their aim was to destroy the Red Army west of the Dnieper, but they hadn't done whatever they did to the Red Army, and they battered it mercilessly. They didn't destroy it. It was still basically there at the end of December. And when you compare both the Red Army and the German army at that time, you will see the Germans pushing their very last battalion down to the line. And the Red Army on the other side is desperately trying to push its final and important reserves into position as well. So it's two armies which were desperately stretched. But in terms of, if you like, survivability, in terms of responsiveness, the Red Army just had the edge. Only just, but they had that vital and important edge.
Eventually, the generals were silenced, and two major objectives were prioritized: the capture of Leningrad and the fall of the Ukraine. A giant pincer movement involving half of Army Group Center and the left flank of Army Group South began to close its jaws on a huge pocket of Russian forces to the rear of Kiev. Field Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet Chief of Staff, pleaded with Stalin for a strategic withdrawal of the troops defending the city. He was dismissed from his post. Marshal Timoshenko, the newly appointed Southwest commander, arrived just in time to see the trapped Soviet divisions. The 600,000 prisoners taken by the Germans remain the highest number ever captured in a single engagement. The battle for the Ukraine now centered on the Crimean Peninsula, where the right flank of Army Group South pressed the Soviet 51st Army back towards Sebastopol. While half of the German Group Center were engaged in subduing the Ukraine, Marshal Zhukov, transferred to the reserve forces behind West Front, seized the opportunity to attack the German Fourth Army. Occupying a salient near Smolensk, the Germans were now themselves vulnerable to encirclement. The Fourth Army were thrown back 12 kilometers, but without sufficient tanks and aircraft, Zhukov failed to tighten the noose he had made. However, in terms of morale, Zhukov's counter-thrust was highly significant. His action was the first substantial Soviet counterattack of the war. Hitler's response was to regroup Army Group Center and prepare the most critical operation of the campaign. Operation Typhoon, the drive towards Moscow, was finally underway. 70 divisions, spearheaded by 1,500 tanks, would race toward the Russian capital before the rains of autumn or the snows of winter could halt their progress. On September the 30th, General Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group almost inevitably broke through the Soviet line and had encircled the defending Bryansk front by the 6th of October. Simultaneously, the Western Front, commanded by Marshal Timoshenko, fell into a similar trap. The pockets of Vyazma and Bryansk, containing 9 armies of 71 divisions, were almost completely destroyed. Another 660,000 troops faced the grim hospitality that the German army meted out to prisoners of war, and the road to Moscow lay open. In the Baltics, by the 16th of August, von Lieb's Army Group North had captured the city of Novgorod, a vital target in the approach to Leningrad. The beleaguered defenders had fought to the death, following the German discovery of the city's defensive plans on the corpse of a Soviet officer. General Hauptner's 4th Panzer Group resumed its drive towards Leningrad, but without supporting infantry, its progress was limited. Leningrad was a vital center of the wartime production industry, and reserves and equipment were poured into the defense of the city. The citizens themselves formed into militia, divisions which were flung against the Germans more in despair than hope. Following a basic training period, averaging 16 hours, the 1st Militia Division was sent to the front 6 days after being formed, the 2nd 2 days, and the 3rd the same day it was established.
there certainly was a surge of patriotism, but there was also, as the war went on, a deepening vengeful feeling, a feeling of revenge. And there was also a sense, and I think whatever artificiality there may be about it, it is true, there was a sense of the kind of morality of this. This is something you had to do. Well, why otherwise did you get kids of 14 working 12, 14 hours a day in ammunition plants? Why did you get a lot of these extraordinary sacrifices on the part of ordinary people who didn't have to do it? And yet under a really ferocious Soviet system which either abandoned the population or brutally coerced them. I mean, they were caught between two fires. I do remember talking to one senior Soviet officer and asking him what really happened in terms of a choice. He said, we were faced with a choice between two dictators, Hitler on the one hand and Stalin on the other, but we preferred to pick the one who spoke Russian.
Despite such gargantuan efforts, the first shells began to pour down on Leningrad early in September. With the arrival of the 18th Army to reinforce the Panzers on the 8th, the German stranglehold on the city tightened further. The capture of Schlüsselburg to the east signaled the end of rail transport. When Marshal Zhukov arrived to take over the defense of the city on the 10th of September, he found the defenders in an advanced state of disorganization and the inhabitants close to panic. Undaunted, he briskly set about bolstering its defences. A shortage of anti-tank guns was dealt with by converting anti-aircraft artillery to the task of attempting to halt the Panzers. 6 brigades of naval infantry and students were formed, and reinforcements drafted in from the Karelian Isthmus. Zhukov began to take the fight to the Germans through raids and counterattacks. But by now, the German troops had pierced the inner circle of defences and were rampaging through the suburbs. After a furious exchange of advances and retreats, at the end of the month, the defenders were still hanging onto their city by their fingernails. It seemed inevitable that Leningrad would capitulate. But as Zhukov awaited a renewed assault, the 4th Panzer Group suddenly departed to join the battle for Moscow, and the remaining German forces began to build defences. Leningrad would not now be taken by force. It would be starved into submission.
All normal rules of warfare, insofar as they apply, were abandoned. And this applied on both sides. For example, as the Soviet partisan movement grew up, then the war became very savage. But I have asked many, many Russians, whom I know very well, really, what really happened? I mean, why did the war change? And basically their explanation was this, both soldiers and civilians, and indeed many of my contemporaries. They said in the first 3 months of the war, that's from June until December, it seemed to be a war like anything else. They realized something terrible had happened. And they heard the Soviet government's statements about German atrocities, but they didn't really believe them. But when the survivors came back into Soviet territory and told the real truth about what was happening, I mean the ghastliness of this, then it suddenly dawned on the Russians that something quite unbelievably terrible had happened. And then you get a change in Russian propaganda, not just government propaganda, not just Stalin on the July the 3rd, 1941, beginning his broadcast, brothers and sisters, and half the Soviet population nearly fainted, I mean, coming from Stalin. Then you get propaganda about kill. You get propaganda about destroy the Germans. You get propaganda about really the full ferocity of this kind of thing on a purely personal basis. It is your responsibility. I mean, I've talked to women soldiers in the Red Army who were tank commanders, who served in artillery battalions, and you ask them, why did you go? Women, why were you there? Why were you handling 100-pound shells, manning anti-aircraft guns? Because they said, my mother and father said you should go.
The German invaders controlled all of Western Russia on a line from Leningrad in the north to Rostov on the Black Sea, and the Red Army was still retreating before them. The countryside they left behind was a wasteland. The first few months of the war had robbed the nation of nearly 50% of her grain-producing lands. Where the armies had fallen back, vast tracts of crops lay ruined in the fields. The rotting carcasses of livestock, slaughtered to deprive the Germans of food, mingled their stench with the corpses of soldiers and peasants. Villages, tumbled into ruins, became the silent memorials of their former inhabitants. The mangled wreckage of sabotaged industries smouldered beneath the skies. Amid the ruin, thousands of starving, orphaned children searched vainly for their parents. But the fighting spirit of the Russians was far from crushed. It had been inflamed by accounts of the slaughter of prisoners of war and the murder and torture committed by the German invaders. Even the constant series of military reverses failed to dampen the ardour of defenders whose motherland had been ravaged.
Their system wasn't perfect. It had sacrificed millions of men. It wasn't all that efficient, but when it was all boiled down, what are they left with? I mean, this barbarous, murderous, genocidal regime which exploited the country, and even more actually, and this is a point which has never much been explored, but which actually humiliated the Russians, denigrated them as a people. And this coming from the Germans, whom they'd always respected as Beethoven, Goethe, Heine. What kind of people were these? It wasn't just the SS. It was the whole German impress of this, which I think shocked the Russians tremendously. It's also a shock from which I think they haven't recovered even to this day.
Who could have foreseen that the siege of Leningrad was not the final stage of a bitter struggle that would bring Hitler domination over the Soviets and Europe? Only in later years could it be recognized as the first move in a conflict of inhumane savagery that had brought Russia to the edge of annihilation, but which eventually led to one of Hitler's greatest failures, the total collapse of the Großraum.